Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Israel Dialogues. You'll see David and I are laughing. We weren't sure if I was going to be able to make it back from my last appointment in time. So I'm thrilled to be here with you today, together with our panel and with our expert guests. This is a bit of a bittersweet moment, but that we're bringing to conclusion this semester of the Israel Dialogues. Um, Before we begin, I hope you saw my email with information about our April 8th session. We've added another session. The panel, our standing panel, really decided to bring about this kind of concluding session based out of a desire to hear from you, your interests, your questions, what has resonated, and what deserves a little more conversation. So in just a moment, I'm going to drop into the chat box a link. It's not a survey. It takes just a minute or so. If you have a question or an area of interest that you would like for the panel to address on April 8th, same time, same link, everything, and I'll send another reminder email to you, encouraging you to take a look at that link and let us know your interests and your questions. For this last session, I just want to send my gratitude again to Arts of Canada, to the Canadian Zionist Federation, to Israel and Golda Kashitsky Center for Jewish Studies at York University, Reformed Jewish Community of Canada, with special gratitude to Helena and David Fine for their generous gift of sponsorship. I also want to thank our panelists, our standing panelists, and all of our guests that have come to be a part of the Israel Dialogues, and of course to each of you for spending the time with us each week to engage in interesting and important conversation. So that's it for me on my end. I'll wish you a Shabbat Shalom, and I'll turn it over to David to set the frame for our conversation today.
Thank you, Rabbi, very much. And I'm glad you were able to make it for the opening. Let me reinforce our hope that many of you who have been following the Israel Dialogues over the last many months will take the opportunity to join us on April the 8th. There is a special link that the Rabbi is uploading, which you can use to send us your questions, your comments, moving not only back into sessions of the past, but raising issues that you may have wanted to hear about which we never had the time or simply wasn't on the agenda. We know that many of you have submitted questions, and very often we don't have a chance to get to them. So we really want to devote this session coming up on the 8th of April, also at 12 noon, as usual, to be able to have a conversation with you in terms of our thinking about and responding to whatever concerns and questions and interests you might have. And that would include suggestions, if there are areas that you think we should think about for future programming. So with that in mind, let me turn to the session for today, which is Germany, Israel, and the Shadow of the Holocaust. We're really very fortunate because one of the members of our core group, Derek Penzler, is a recognized expert in this issue, this area of research and teaching and commentary. And he's used his good offices and his professional contacts to invite two of the leading scholars who are well positioned to address this important topic. Before I turn to Derek to invite him to introduce our guests and then to lead the session, let me just say that I think we all are acutely aware of and concerned about the events over the last months in Europe, and especially the last 4 weeks, where tensions have exploded into an invasion and war. and it brings back a lot of memory and history, some of it very troubling, but it reinforces the power of memory and how it can be used for good or ill. So as we explore this difficult and challenging topic, we have in mind, I think, at least for some of us who are engaged in current affairs, thinking about and reflecting on what are the lessons that we can learn from the past that might better inform us about what has happened today and what options might be available for the international community to undertake. So with that, Derek, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, David. Hello, everyone. I know that the Israel Dialogue sessions so far have largely been about Israel's relations with very large countries or with regional blocs. We've talked about Israel and the European Union, Israel and the United Nations, Israel and the Abraham Accords, Israel and the United States. And in comparison, the story of Israel's relationship with Germany might appear a bit small. After all, Germany is a medium-sized country. But obviously the historic legacy of Israeli-German relations is deep. It's painful, it's tragic, but it's also extremely important. And Germany and Israel are actually, the relationship between them is of great global and strategic significance, as well as of historic importance. And I couldn't be happier with any speakers or happier with any speakers than those two that have agreed to join us today, Michael Brenner and Johannes Becker. Michael is the Seymour and Lillian Abendson Chair in Israel Studies, and he's the Director for Israel Studies at American University in Washington, D.C. He's also Professor for Jewish History and Culture at Ludwig Maximilians University in Munich. Michael has many honors and has written many books, so I'm just going to mention a few things: that he's a fellow of the Bavarian Academy of Sciences, the American Academy for Jewish Research, and the Accademia Nazionale Virgiliana in Mantua. He's also been awarded the Order of Merit by the Federal Republic of Germany. He has written at least 9 books, translated into 10 languages, including his penultimate book was called In Search of Israel. It's a wonderful, very accessible introduction or overview to the history of Zionism in Israel, but with a unifying theme about the interaction between Zionism as an ideal and then the realization of that ideal with the challenges and sometimes the disappointments that brings. It's really a beautifully wrought book, and I recommend it highly. He's also written a short history of the Jews, a 1-volume history of Jewish civilization, a brief history of Zionism. He wrote a wonderful book called The Renaissance of Jewish Culture in Weimar Germany. And I'll just mention his most recent book, which is just coming out in English now, In Hitler's Munich, Jews, Anti-Semitism, and the Rise of Nazism. So it's wonderful to have Michael with us. And along with Michael, Professor Johannes Becker, who is also a professor of Israel and Middle Eastern Studies at the Heidelberg Center for Jewish Studies. As an undergraduate, Johannes studied at Heidelberg, Cairo, and the University of Illinois. So we have a very interesting life path here. And he got a doctorate at the Free University of Berlin and was granted a postdoctoral fellowship at Oxford, which is where I first got to know Johannes. He's currently heading at Heidelberg University a research group called Gathering the Dispersed: State Evasion and State Making in Modern Jewish, Kurdish, and Berber History. So Johannes clearly thinks about Jews and about Israel in ways that are a bit outside of the box. He's recently published a book titled The Land Beyond the Border: State Formation and Territorial Expansion in Syria, Morocco, and Israel. So again, many thanks to both of you for joining us. So Johannes, I believe you're in Jerusalem.
That's correct, though. Close to Damascus Gate.
You're close to Damascus, and Michael is in Washington. So let me begin by asking actually a personal question of the two of you. I think the first book I ever read about Germany and Israel, which goes back, I think the book came out in the late 60s, was called Deutschlands Weg nach Israel, Germany's Path to Israel. And I saw the title on my shelf yesterday, and it made me think of both of you, because you're very different people. You've had very different paths to Israel, and yet you're both professors of Israel studies. And Michael, you divide your time between Germany and the United States. Johannes, you're based in Germany, but you're both very deeply connected to Israel. And I was wondering if each of you could talk a little bit about your own personal background and how that, as it were, led you to Israel. And maybe we'll start with Michael.
Thank you, Derek. Wow. I guess it goes back as long as I can remember. I grew up in Germany, and both my parents were Holocaust survivors who had family in Israel. So we went there when I was little, and each time when we went there, my relatives in Israel would say, "How can you live in Germany? Come here. You can go on vacation to Germany." And you know, that was my first exposure, I think, to Israel. And I actually recently found my bar mitzvah speech, which of course I didn't write, I guess, but back then my teacher wrote it, I assume, as much as I remember. And oh, it was full of Zionism and what are we doing here in Germany? That was still in the 70s. So it was a time when German Jews felt very insecure in Germany. And I remember not my parents, but other German Jews of their generation, when they came to Israel still in the 70s, they would kind of be ashamed of living in Germany. And when they were asked where they are from, some would say, "We're from Austria," or "We're from Switzerland," when they spoke German. I think a few years later, it was worse to say I'm from Austria, with Waldheim and all the anti-Semitism rising there. And Switzerland wasn't that great anymore either. And Germany maybe became better in the eyes of Israelis, certainly today. So these were my experiences. And much later, of course, then there were academic approaches. I went to study in Heidelberg, where Johannes teaches now. I came there in the 1980s. And as part of my studies, I went to Israel, to the Hebrew University for a year, and then I went for another year to write my master's thesis there. So that was, of course, my first academic exposure to Israel, and later I taught there as well.
And Johannes, what's your Weg nach Israel? A bit different.
Different indeed, yeah. So my father was a Protestant pastor. So I'm very much non-Jewish, though my wife is Jewish from Ukraine, which is a topic I think we'll get to in the end at some point. So I think my first exposure to the topic of German-Israeli, but also Christian-Jewish relations came through kind of classic interfaith activities done by my father. Might have been the reason why in the end I decided not to serve in the German army for a year, back when it was still compulsory, but instead decided to spend a year in Israel with Aktion Sühnezeichen, which roughly translates as Operation Atonement, and which is kind of a classic way for non-Jewish Germans to get exposed to Israeli culture and society. And a lot of people who end up studying Israel or teaching about Israel actually come from this background. And I mean, I think that was during the Second Intifada, actually, so kind of a rough exposure to the actual conflict. And of course, once you've started to learn Hebrew, you're kind of sucked into this topic. So I wrote a master thesis about the Israeli army, a PhD thesis about Israel's occupation. Israel studies wasn't really a thing back in time. So I think thanks to my postdoc with you in Oxford, I kind of got this notion that maybe Israel studies also might become a research field one day. And then a new position opened up in Heidelberg. Ever since I've been a professional Israelist. So I think Munich and Heidelberg are kind of two places where if you're really interested in Israel studies, then you can actually learn Hebrew and actually learn about Israeli history. I think what adds in terms of complexity is the fact which you mentioned that I've also spent some time in the Middle East. And I've also learned Arabic, and I've spent time in Cairo and traveling to Morocco and Syria when it still was possible, which gives an additional layer to my focus on Israel. So it's not just through this German-Israeli lens, but it also tries to look at Israel from kind of a more regional focus.
So it's great to have both of you with your very different perspectives to talk with us about Germany and Israel. And we can scale up now from your individual to collective experience. So let's maybe go back in time a bit. We'll have plenty of time to talk about the present and the future. But let's talk a little bit about the past, which is how Germany, and by that I mean the former West Germany, and I think most of the people who are listening or watching are old enough to remember that there were two Germanys for quite a long time. And then they reunited or united, depending on your politics, in 1990. How did West Germany find its path to Israel in the 1950s and 60s? Or is it that Germany and Israel found each other? After all, at the end of the war, I believe that in Israeli passports, it said that the passport was valid for entry into any country except Germany. So there was such hatred, understandable hatred, animus. How could these countries possibly find their way to each other? And who initiated the conflict? Was it Germany that wanted the contact, or was it Israel? Did one have a greater need of the other? I mean, how could these countries ever possibly have established relations given the horrors of the past? Michael, do you want to go first? Or?
Sure. So interestingly, there was an Israeli consulate in Germany, or maybe I should say on German soil, long before there were relations. When the state of Israel was established, they also established an Israeli consulate in Munich, but it was not related or credited with the German government and federal West Germany, Federal Republic of Germany only came to existence a year after Israel, 1949. It was actually with the American, by then still occupying forces of southern Germany. And the reason was not diplomatic relations between the two states, but to help the about 250,000 Jewish displaced persons, or DPs, who were Holocaust survivors stranded in the American zone of Germany, to go to Israel. So that's an interesting chapter before the actual relations started, but we shouldn't conflate it with German-Israeli relations, of course. And as you say, it was very complicated because obviously for Israel, it was not an easy matter to establish relations to a state that was just responsible for killing 6 million Jews. And for Germany, it wasn't either. For Germany, it wasn't because of the involvement of so many Germans. How can we just go and the next day we establish relations to the Jewish state? And there was another reason why many German politicians, especially the State Department, the Foreign Office in Germany, was hesitant. How would it affect Germany's relations with the Arab states? So there were all kinds of difficult relations. But I think in a very decisive incision was 1952, when there was the first kind of, relationship between the two through the reparation payments. So both had an interest in the relations. Germany had an interest because, of course, it helped to bring it back into the family of nations if the Jewish state, the state that represents most of the victims of, the victims of the Holocaust, would relate to, would establish official relations. And Israel had an interest because of material reasons mainly. They needed weapons. They had a very weak economy. They needed a partner. And long before the official ties were established in 1965, there were, throughout the 1950s, all kinds of economic and also military relations between the two. So I think I stop here because maybe I'm sure that Johannes can add something.
Johannes.
Yeah, I think as Michael pointed out, it begins kind of as a strategic symbiosis, right? It's two countries who really can gain from these ties. Israel, of course, needs economic and military material, and Western Germany is very much interested in this Westbindung of really being anchored in the West. And I think whether it's this emerging community of European nations or NATO, West Germany would never have been able to join these institutions without having some kind of rebranding of its image, to put it cynically. Two important dimensions existed already before these diplomatic relations become official. One of them is, as Michael already mentioned, kind of this military angle. Yeah, so military cooperation, intelligence sharing. That's an important axis until today. And the second one would be kind of interfaith relations. Yeah, so one of the core actors actually was the Protestant Church, which started sending ministers to Israel, which started in the case of Aktionsunitzeichen, sending volunteers to Israel. So I think today those would be two important milieus that are very much shaping German-Israeli relations, the kind of the military intelligence apparatus and kind of this dimension of interfaith.
It's funny, as I've last few years, as you know, I spent a lot of time working on a biography of one man, Theodor Herzl, and it's made me think a lot about the relationship between the individual and then broader material or geopolitical forces in history. So, I mean, all the reasons you've given for that establishment of relations they all make good sense. But there's certainly a popular image that when I started reading about this as a young man, that it really had to do with these two great figures, these towering figures, one of whom your chair is named after, Johannes, David Ben-Gurion, and his relationship with Konrad Adenauer. And it's not just the question of the relationship between the two men, but both of these men make heroic decisions or risky decisions and unpopular decisions. It's not clear to me exactly how popular the idea of paying reparations, for example, to Israel was in Germany in the 1950s. And certainly for Ben-Gurion, establishing or even receiving what I believe was called blood money by Menachem Begin, Ben-Gurion's perennial opponent. And so to what extent is this also a function of great individuals, of Adenauer and Ben-Gurion, and as well as these broader forces you've talked about?
Well, I think, sure, the two old men, as they were at the time, had similar worldviews in many respects, but I wouldn't give too much weight to it. Both were no longer in office when the two countries actually had their official relations in 1965, and actually when they met the first time as well. But I think that it was important for both of them to be there at the place. If Menachem Begin had been Prime Minister of Israel, no doubt that would have been impossible in the 1960s. In Germany, it's a little different. If the Social Democrats had been in power already, that might have actually been a little easier because Adenauer had to fight against resistance in his own party. And I would say one other, if we talk about personal relationships and cultural aspects, I would also remind us that when we think of Israel's population at the time, we can't only think of the dimension of Holocaust survivors. Many of those people, and some, of course, of the Holocaust survivors, so those who had emigrated before, had a German-speaking and German cultural background. When I say German cultural, that also includes many East European Jews, Yiddish speakers, who felt close to the German-speaking culture. So it was, in a way, a complex and often a love-hate relationship in Israel towards Germany and the German-speaking world.
Johannes, did you want to comment about Ben-Gurion and his?
I leave the question of the great man theory to the historians. I just wanted to point out that when I was a volunteer in Israel with Aktionsunitzeichen, those were the kind of people I met in a nursing home, which was kind of a religious nursing home for German-speaking Jews. So it's exactly this generation which kind of, in a lot of cases, left Germany just in time in the early 30s. Instead, very much spoke German with a local accent and watched German television and read German newspapers. And indeed, I mean, whenever German ambassadors or German chancellors go to Israel, there's always an attempt to kind of meet the last survivors of this German Jewish community in Israel.
It is a different world now. I mean, I remember, I'm old enough that when I started going to Israel, that generation was still very much alive and kicking. And the Jerusalem neighborhood of Rehavia was largely German speaking. And you would hear it in the street. And I knew these people. And I mean, I've probably told you both the story that when I was having a hard time reading documents in the old handwriting, there were old women who I befriended who would invite me up for coffee and cake. And they would read the documents as easily as I was reading the newspaper. And not only could they read the documents easily, they could read all of the unattributed quotations from Goethe, Lessing, and Schiller, because these were people who had had a proper humanistic education. So there was a real connection there that, of course, yes, the German government could take advantage of. But something very odd is that, of course, it's understandable that Israel would have a lot of hostility towards Germany, and and yet Israel established relations with Austria, which was Hitler's homeland, in 1949. And Israel established relations with Poland, which is the graveyard of European Jewry, and no small amount of anti-Semitism in Poland during and after World War II. And yet it established relations with Poland in 1948. So it's understandable why there would be this problematic involving Germany, but I'm wondering why in Israel somehow it was easier to deal with other countries that were sites of the Holocaust.
Well, I think in a way, official Israel, I'm saying official Israel, bought into the official Austrian version of post-World War II, that Austria was the first victim of the Nazis, and that it was Hitler who, invaded this poor little country. Of course, we all know the Austrians were not exactly standing there defending themselves against Hitler, but welcomed him. And for many decades, that was the official version of history preached in Austria. And Israel, I think, in search of partners, was able to close at least one eye and say, well, we distinguish between Germany, that was responsible, and Austria, that was, maybe if not a victim, then only a secondary perpetrator. I think that, again, as I said before, that changed and became more complex when Kurt Waldheim became president of Austria in the 1980s, and people looked into his own Nazi past, and more than that, into the way Austria had not dealt by the 1980s, with its own past as Germany did by then, or started to do by then. And then it became, I would say, a little reversed. And when a right-wing, extreme right-wing party, the FPÖ, became part of the Austrian governing coalition a few years later, they even withdrew the ambassador. Israel withdrew the ambassador from Austria, where by then, we're talking about the 1990s, they had excellent relations with Germany.
All right.
I think with Poland, it was somewhat easier since Israel was very much interested in kind of having support from two camps in the emerging Cold War. And so once the Soviet Union had been pro-partition, having ties to Eastern European countries that were also in a certain way victims of the Nazi regime simply made geostrategic sense. Personally, I'm not surprised that it took Israel so long to have official ties to Germany, because, and I think that's something that kind of historians are more and more investigating these days. If you look at the political elites that ran Western Germany, they had not really been exchanged, right? So this process of denazification is kind of a major myth. So if you look at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, if you look at the Bundeswehr, if you look at the Ministry of Justice, so in a way, the people that the state of Israel had to talk to in the late 40s and 50s were very much ex-Nazis. And of course, that might have made it somewhat difficult to say, well, we're diplomatically fully recognizing this West German state.
So let's move up further in time, sort of the grand sweep from history through to the present, which is when we talk about a special relationship between Israel and another country, usually that term refers to the United States. But that term has also been used for Germany. Whether it's the 1970s, 80s, even up to our own time, the notion of a special relationship. And I'm wondering to what extent that relationship has continued to exist or if it's changed form, because so much has happened. If we think about 1965 to the present, I mean, we're talking about 60 years. And there was, the height and then the collapse of the Cold War, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the unification of Germany. To what extent has this special relationship been maintained, and especially as the time since the end of the Second World War and the memories of the Holocaust do fade, does this special relationship survive? I don't know who wants to take that first.
I'll give it a go, and Michael can add. So of course, the political scientist would say, well, most relationships are special in a way. But this actually might be a unique case of a special relationship. And I think it's still quite a particular relationship. And every 5 to 10 years or so, you have these essays or books that say, well, from now on, it's a normalized relationships, right? So Brandt tried that at some point early on. Until today, there's always calls to, well, if we want to normalize our relations, maybe we have to be more critical towards Israel. That's kind of a standard argument on parts of the left. If you look at the way how the two countries interact, it's still not a fully normalized relationship, and it probably won't be for a few generations, if you ask me. If you look at the way how German politicians behave when they're here, if you look at this huge discussion whether Israelis living in Berlin should be recognized as kind of an Israeli diaspora, that's not just expats, but people who actually want to live to Germany, want to move to Berlin, get a German passport, and actually stay there long term. So I think tiny case studies, you'll see that there's still very sensitive issues at hand. If you look at the way how youth exchange is happening between their countries, if you look at scholarly relationships, so if we compare the enormous interest that you have in Israel when it comes to German culture, and of course the enormous interest that Germans would have in kind of Jewish culture and Israeli history, I think it's easy to feel just by talking to students that they know that this is kind of a core issue which also touches upon their own identity. So yeah, it's very, very much a special relationship.
I agree. I think we have of course different levels of what we discuss. We have the personal level of relationships, and we have a political official relationship. On the personal level, I think I actually, if you look at it from the other side, from Israel towards Germany, I started by saying when I, as a child in the 1970s, came to Israel on visits, I was often asked by my relatives, how can you live there? You should live here. And today, of course, it is normal for many Israelis just not only to visit, but as Johannes mentioned, there are, 20,000 or more Israelis living in Berlin today. and so many more, of course, just go and visit. And I don't think that anyone really has major issues in buying German products today. So all of that has changed. And it is reflected in the official relations. But I also would say there was a time when it was more, when on the personal level, Israel was more on the map of many young Germans, because it was still so much closer to the Holocaust and so much more closer to their own family history. Often for Germans, young Germans in the 70s or even 60s, coping with the story of their parents and grandparents. And today it's become more normal, and that means maybe also a little bit less exciting to just go there. I think there was a lot of excitement when, let's say, German cities started twin city projects with Israeli cities. I know last year Munich and Beersheba became twin cities, and it went almost unnoticed. It wasn't a big deal. And so in that way, there was a certain normalization. It's interesting, the German foreign minister, a young, relatively young woman from the Green Party, Minister Baerbock, she went on her visit to Israel. Of course, she visited Yad Vashem, as every politician does on their state visit. And it seemed very different, let's say, than someone from the Merkel generation. She only had been once to Israel before, and she didn't really know the country, and she seemed to relate to it, if you look at the interview, in a much more normal way. And I think actually that's a good development, if you ask me. I think that's what both sides will profit from in the future. You can't always have the kind of, on one hand, you have the bad conscience of the family background or of the collective memory. And on the other side, you try to put some salt in the wound. So this is not going to work forever. But if both countries, on the basis of this very unique and special history, try to develop a normal relationship, I think that's a good point. That's a good thing. And as Johannes, of course, knows much better as a political scientist, I would say today within the European Union, Germany very often, not always, but very often is one of the strongest partners of Israel.
And that's something that I wanted to talk about a bit more, because I think certainly for older Jews, there is something jarring about going to Berlin and walking through the streets of the Prenzlauer Berg and hearing a lot of Hebrew. I mean, a lot of English too, but a lot of Hebrew. And the fact that so many young Israelis are going not just to Germany. I mean, they're in Amsterdam, they're all over Europe, but Germany is particularly attractive. It's also perhaps a bit odd for an outsider, let's say a Jew in Canada or the United States, to see the Israeli military dealing on a open basis with ThyssenKrupp, a company that combines, as it were, two horrible legacies from the Nazi period. And yet, Israel, you mentioned, has been receiving German weaponry, first light weaponry, and more recently submarines in recent decades. I was wondering if either of you could talk a little bit more about that military side of things, because that's something that I think a lot of people know about the reparations payments, but the extent of German military involvement with Israel is something that's perhaps a bit less well known. I mean, the German government kept it secret for quite some time. Johannes, this might be more in your wheelhouse.
I'll give it a go. So if we look at German-Israeli ties, as already mentioned, military relations begin before diplomatic relations. Until today, I think Germany is also getting something out of this, right? So if we look at Germany's policy in the Middle East, it's always helpful to have one Middle Eastern country that's relatively stable, has interesting ties in the region, and has a close look at its neighbors. So I think this military and intelligence relationship also goes both ways. But yes, if we look at this intriguing case of German submarines that are being delivered to Israel at a reduced rate, this directly touches upon Israel's nuclear strategy, according to foreign sources, as I have to say in Jerusalem, of course. So, I mean, they're sent to Israel, not exactly to be used for Israel's second strike capacity, but of course, Israel is reusing them in an interesting way. And I think that touches upon perhaps what former Chancellor Merkel has described as kind of Germans' responsibility for Israel being part of our raison d'etat, of our Staatsräson. Few people know what this actually means, but I think if we look at military ties and if we look at the way how Israel uses German submarines for its second strike capacity, it lets you know that there is something very concrete behind this lofty slogan.
I should point out these are diesel powered, right? These are diesel submarines. These are not, when you say nuclear, it's not that they are nuclear submarines. I want to make sure everyone understands. But rumor has it that they are aftermarket fitted for firing nuclear missiles. So they say.
Which Israel might have or not have.
That's right. Okay. Yeah, and it's an aspect with which most Israelis feel comfortable. I mean, the submarine affair that's been such a controversy in Israeli politics under Netanyahu was largely because of corruption involved with the sale, but not the sale itself. I mean, this was considered to be kind of par for the course. But let's talk now also about present issues involving anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism in Germany, and particularly the rise in recent years within Germany, which had a fairly stable political system of a kind of center-right party, the Christian Democrats, and a kind of center-left Social Democrats, and then you had the Green Party. But then in recent years, you had this new right-wing party called the AfD, the Alternative for Germany, which represents a form of this kind of populist protest party of which we've seen so many examples throughout the world in recent years, if not decades. So in Germany, is there actually like a difference of opinion regarding Israel? Will you find that in certain political camps in Germany, you'll find very high levels of hostility to Israel, and others you'll find very strong levels of support? Or is it more muted between left and right? Maybe you can map out the political map in Israel and where they stand on Israel. Michael, what would you say?
Well, I mean, the irony is that the far right party, the Alternative for Germany, tries to come across as very pro-Israel, which, by the way, is not such an exception across Europe among far right parties. And Israel itself had some far right parties in its previous government. So, well, let's say previous, and still Israel, I would say, usually Israeli officials were smart enough to keep distance from those alleged friends. The criticism of the far left party, which is called just the left party of Israel, is more outspoken. As across the spectrum with far left parties often is the case. They take more of a Palestinian side, but it's probably less explicit than in many other European countries because it's Germany. But it is a party that is very strong in formerly communist East Germany, and there is a whole history because East Germany did not have relations, never had relations with Israel. So all the parties in between, center right, center left, center, I wouldn't see a major difference in their attitudes towards Israel. You have politicians in all of those parties who are very engaged in the German-Israeli cooperation and dialogue, and you have others who are more critical. But overall, all of the mainstream parties, I would say, are quite supportive of Israel, which is not the case in every European state.
So when some people hear about the German left or the far left in Israel, they might think of the Rote Armee Fraktion, the Red Army faction, Baader Meinhof, hijackings in the what was it,
70s, yeah.
1970s hijackings. And I mean, that was a spectacular moment of left-wing, far left-wing political violence. And but it faded in Germany. And the question is if, and Johannes, you probably know about this also from, well, personal circumstances, since you're married to someone who's an expert on these sorts of things. To what extent in Germany today, I mean, much of Europe, Belgium, for example, France, there have been issues with politicized Islamicist groups and terrorism against Jewish targets, against non-Jewish targets. And to what extent in Germany that same sort of thing does or doesn't exist? That is, whether it's more muted in Germany. That is, to what extent the violence, for example, against Jews, that's often perpetrated in a way that anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism are completely, they get completely linked together in many cases. In Europe, to what extent this is a phenomenon in Germany as well, or is it more muted? Johannes, you're probably close.
I mean, as Michael pointed out, if you look at kind of the mainstream political parties, everybody's pro-Israel and even competing who's the most pro-Israeli. But once we move kind of to the political fringes, this phenomenon of hatred towards Israel, I mean, it's not really intellectual anti-Zionism, it really is hatred of Israel, becomes more apparent. And of course, this exists in three basic forms, right? So it's left-wing radical anti-imperialism, the former Rote Armee Fraktion, which really doesn't exist anymore. It's right-wing anti-Semitism mixed with hatred towards Israel. And of course, it's radical political Islam. And if you look at kind of opinion polls among European Jews or German Jews, who they feel most threatened by, it's not always the right-wing camp, right? So if you look at kind of physical violence in the street for wearing a kippah, for speaking in Hebrew, quite often it's Muslims in Germany, and it's very often Arab migrants, very often Palestinians. So that is very much an issue, not in the sense of kind of right-wing, of kind of political Islamist cells that have an intense focus on Israel, but in kind of everyday forms of hatred towards Jewish and Israeli targets. That's very much a phenomenon.
And Michael, is this a phenomenon that concerns you in particular as a German phenomenon, or do you see it more as just a European or even a global phenomenon?
I would say that Germany has just become more European in that sense. We wish it wouldn't have in that sense. And we see phenomena we saw in France and Britain before. I remember in the 1990s, the vast majority of Muslims in Germany were still of Turkish background. And Turkey then still had good relations with Israel. And I even remember some of the Yom Ha'atzmaut, the Israeli Independence Day public parties in German streets, and there were some Turkish associations, there are Turkish flags there. That has changed since Erdogan and since his anti-Israel stance, although that might change just again as we're speaking. But of course, and the other thing that has changed is that that so many more immigrants, Muslim immigrants now from Arab countries came in. Now, I think it's complex. Of course, not all of them are anti-Israel and certainly not anti-Semitic. We can't deny that exists. At the same time, often Jews and Muslims in Germany also have kind of common interests. There was a very intense debate in the early 2000s, well, not that long ago, actually, 2010s, about circumcision, if it should be outlawed in Germany. And of course, Jews and Muslims now work together. There are always debates about ritual slaughter. Jews and Muslims work together. And they also often work together when it doesn't come to those concrete issues. But Germany is still a more, I would say, culturally Christian state. In certain ways, like you have religious education in public schools, you have something like church tax or religious tax, which you pay when you belong to a Christian or a Jewish congregation, not the Muslim congregations. And this and also in everyday life, people don't say usually happy holidays in December. They say, no matter who you are, if you see you, they say Merry Christmas. So in that way, I think on a cultural level, I've seen this among many young Jews and Muslims especially. They say, you know what, our society is changing. And it's not only Jews now who are a minority. There are so many Muslims. Actually, there are, of course, many more Muslims than Jews in Germany. I think about 4 to 5 million Muslims and maybe 200,000 Jews in Germany.
So you're talking about areas of concord, or where Jews and Muslims in Germany can work together in common causes, but certainly there's going to be flashpoints of anger and violence. There was a court decision in Wuppertal, or about Wuppertal, where a synagogue, I think it was petrol-bombed, firebombed. And the court decision was that this could not be ruled an anti-Semitic act because it was a political act, right? A pro-Palestinian political act. And I believe, you can correct me, I think it was upheld at by a higher court. And I was just wondering if this had ripples in Germany, or if people found this to be disturbing, because that would seem to be a case where, at least by most North American standards, this is clearly an anti-Semitic attack when you attack a synagogue. But the German court thought otherwise.
I think the basic literacy when it comes to Jewish history, Judaism as religion, Zionism, and the State of Israel, especially in non-Jewish German circles, is quite limited. So the distinction between saying, well, this is a religious symbol, it's a house of God, that has probably nothing to do with the Middle East conflict, and this might be an actually Israeli target, doesn't seem to exist in the minds of certain German judges. My impression is, if we look at the last 5 to 10 years, is that kind of this increasing wave of anti-Semitism in various political camps, right, whether it's left-wing, right-wing, or Islamist, also has led to a certain counter-reaction in terms of raising awareness, in terms of integrating this focus on anti-Semitism and hatred towards Israel into the basic curriculum in schools and universities. So it's not all bad. And particularly the link between kind of hatred towards anything that's Jewish and Islamophobia very much exists among educators, just to add something positive as well.
Maybe I could ask both of you to comment as we move towards the end of this part of I've just got two more questions. One is about the Jewish community of Germany itself and its own relations with Israel. The kind of, I guess one would be what sort of activities it encourages or sponsors, but also, I'm trying to think how to put this, acceptable speech that is within Jewish communities in North America. Not only is there a lot of debate about Israel, there's also a lot of debate about what kind of debate we may have about Israel. What kinds of things may we say and may we not say? Where are the red lines? For example, Hillel, the organization of university and college student Jewish organizations, there are actually very strict guidelines what may and may not be said about Israel. And to what extent the Jewish community in Germany is connected with Israel, what kind of latitude it allows itself in talking about Israel. I think both of you have had quite extensive experience on these issues, with these issues. Maybe we'll start with Michael and then Johannes.
Right. So again, there is, talking as a historian, there is a huge difference from the time I grew up and today. I mean, I remember the Jewish communities were, if you walked into a Jewish community center, it often looked like, you know, maybe a travel agency for Israel. There were pictures of beautiful landscapes of Israel and Golda Meir and Moshe Dayan, and it was all about Israel. And I remember, at least my experience was that you were told that's where your future is. And people gave, it was like a tax. You were supposed to give a certain percentage of your income to, as they called it, their makbit, to the, you know, to the Jewish agency and to the, or Karen, all kinds of Israeli purposes, funds. And that has changed because well, first of all, we have to see the majority of the Jews of living in Germany today, talking about 80% at least, are people who came from the former Soviet Union after 1989. The Jewish community was tiny before, there was 30,000 people. And in fact, many of them did emigrate. And today we have maybe 200,000, only about half of them members of a community, but they were themselves immigrants, or maybe now children of immigrants. And while I still would say the relationship with Israel is very profound and very deep, it is not the same as it used to be in the 60s and 70s, where you just lived with a bad conscience in Germany. These people came to Germany and choose it. They could have gone to Israel. But it also means many of them have relatives in Israel, and they're don't forget, it's close. Most, you know, I would say, I think most American Jews, I don't know about Canadian, but most American Jews, US American Jews, had never been to Israel in their life. That's not the case for Jews in Europe, where, you know, it's a 4-hour flight from Berlin or Munich, Munich even less, to Tel Aviv, and people often go there very frequently. But you also mentioned the other question, and that's of course complicated. What, you know, in a political and especially academic context, what are you allowed, or what are you supposed to say within the Jewish context? It's very, I would say we don't have that much time to go into all the details, but there are also leftist Jewish groups or liberal Jewish groups, where everything, you know, is quite tolerant, what you can say. And there are others where every criticism of Israel is seen as kind of anti-Semitism. And I think we have to make sure that we distinguish between criticism of Israeli politics and policies and anti-Semitism. That's not always the case, but I don't see it as that different, honestly, than in the context I at least am familiar with in the United States, and especially the academic context. But maybe Johannes has a different picture here.
We'll get kind of to the limits of acceptable speech, but I want to just point out an interesting gap when it comes to the Jewish education system, of which I'm part of, right? So the Center for Jewish Studies in Heidelberg is run by the Zentralrat, Central Council of Jews in Germany. My impression, if I look at kind of the Jewish students we get, is that it's interesting that the German Jewish education system was very much built by often Israelis or German Jews who came back from Israel and wanted to build a very Zionist education system where most words are simply in Hebrew, right? So it's the madrich, and it's the kvutza, and it's the machane. So it sounds super Zionist on paper. And then if you look at the outcome of this education system, my impression is that the level of actual understanding of modern Hebrew is quite limited, even among people who are graduates of German Jewish high schools. Basic knowledge about Zionist and Israeli history is also quite limited. So there's of course this notion that we're supposed to be Zionists, and by being pro-Israel we can somehow justify living on German soil. But that doesn't mean that there's a high level of intellectual engagement. Maybe that's changing, but from what I see, there's a huge knowledge gap between kind of Jews in Germany and Jews in North America. When it comes to the limits of public speech, one way of looking at it is maybe simply looking at anecdotes. So in my classes, when I'm teaching let's call it a sensitive subject. Yeah, so let's say the occupation. On purpose, I will say that students need to bring at least 2 years of modern Hebrew, just to make sure that it's actually students of Jewish studies who come with a basic understanding of Israel and hopefully also of the Middle East, and just to make sure that there's no activists among the students. I think one problem of discourse about Israel in a German context, whether that's Jewish or non-Jewish, is that we have ongoing cycles of scandalization, right? So somebody says something maybe insensitive or maybe problematic, and then you have, at least for 1 week, kind of a media scandal. And that's something that a lot of people would like to avoid. I'm not sure that's terribly different from the North American context. I think what is maybe the core difference is that's at least my impression, is that discourses about Jewish ties to Israel usually take place behind closed doors, right? So this doesn't reach the public. This is stuff that you talk about at the Machaneh. This is stuff you talk about maybe at a talk within the limits of a synagogue. But at least when it comes to kind of public events, you get the impression that there's kind of a mainstream opinion, at least of organized Jewry. So the Zentralrat, which is very much pro-Zionist. And I think what's less apparent in German case is kind of the increasing mainstreaming of Jewish anti-Zionism, which in Germany really seems to be a phenomenon among certain Israeli expats in Berlin. But it hasn't really grown into a larger movement.
My own sense is that there is some difference on that score between, say, Germany and North America. But the main difference I sense as an outsider in some ways to both countries, and maybe this has changed because I started going to Germany in the 1970s, was a kind of a discomforting philo-Semitism. And this is, of course, the legacy of guilt and a bad conscience, and maybe sometimes genuine penitence in response to the Holocaust. And so an exaggerated pro-Israel stance, an exaggerated philo-Semitism, people going out of their way to be nice to me or whatever, once they find that I'm Jewish. And it can manifest itself in bizarre forms, even in Germany today. So the group, Johannes, that I know you're interested in, known as the anti-German Germans or something, who, they're very pro-Israel, aren't they? This group? Who are these people?
Yeah, so that's a puzzling topic. And if I mention it to audiences outside of Germany, people just don't get it, because it doesn't make sense that you would have kind of a radical left-wing movement that is super pro-Israel. And it's also puzzling that very much ethnic Germans would describe themselves as anti-Germans or anti-Deutsche. It's an intriguing Maoist or post-Maoist cult, which has an interesting vision of history. And if you ask me, seeks to atone for left-wing anti-Zionism in the 60s and 70s by being super pro-Israel. I'm not sure it's more than a few hundred people, but if you see people, let's say, with an IDF T-shirt in Berlin, chances are it's an anti-German and not an Israeli.
Yeah. I think it's an exaggerated, very exaggerated and quite fringe phenomenon, but it's interesting because I think it represents the extreme of a much broader phenomenon that was at least quite common. When I was a student in Germany back in the 1970s, for example, I remember my landlord didn't know I was Jewish. And when he found out, he was visibly upset, not upset, but perturbed. And he would cut out little newspaper stories from Die Welt which is a conservative German newspaper, about the strength of the IDF, or the Israeli Air Force does it again, or, our common enemy in Palestinian terrorism. He would literally slip these articles under my door to basically show me how wonderful Israel was. And clearly he was working through a bad conscience, especially when he made some pro-Nazi comments one time when he was drunk at a dinner party. So, those are my experiences. And clearly Germany's changed a lot since then. And I think that's actually the to me, rather surprising thing that's come out of our conversation, is how, to the extent that there are worrisome phenomena in Germany about anti-Semitism, about and criticism of Israel going, or morphing into full-fledged anti-Semitism, that this isn't necessarily a German phenomenon tied directly to the German anti-Semitic past of 1933 to 1945, although it draws on those motifs sometimes, but that it's more of a European, it's a very disturbing phenomenon, but it's everywhere in Europe, and not missing from North America as well. So with that, we'll stop. And I know that we only have, I went on a little longer because I know we have a reduced panel, but if Howard or David have questions, and then as time permits, we can, if people have, people who are tuning in, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A, and we can pose them. So David and Howard, do you want to come back and join us? David and Howard, where are you? Oh, there's Howard.
Coming.
And there's David. Okay.
Sorry, I'm more awkward in doing it. David, you're going to go first?
No, you go ahead.
Well, while you were talking, I was thinking of when I was in Germany after the reunion of Germany and East and West. And I was in as part of a team to retrain East German political scientists, etc., from the methodology they'd been taught to understand critical writing and essay writing. And the experience was very depressing for me because I found that 90% couldn't get reformed. They couldn't think critically in the way we do in Western universities. And it's this overhang of ideology from the Nazi era to Germany, from East German communism. So there's been a double revolution in their mental thinking, which they have to undergo and reform. But the overhang seemed, not that they wanted this overhang, but it was terrible in their capacity to deal with things. What have you found in that respect?
I'll say something as a political scientist myself. Until today, if you look at kind of basic polls, it really stands out to what extent Eastern Germany has a different political culture and very different voting patterns. And that also relates to the question of German-Israeli ties. East Germany, interestingly enough, had a very short period of teaching Israel studies as a subject at university, in Humboldt University. But if you look at their publications, it really was Soviet-style enemy studies. So it's not really trying to engage with Zionism in Israeli society, but trying to understand kind of the Cold War enemy. And if we look at kind of the major German political foundations that are also doing work in Israel and in Palestine, it does stand out that the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, which also does great work, has a very critical stance toward Israel for a number of reasons. And one reason is that this post-communist party is legally the successor party of the East German Communist Party. So it's the people who run the apparatus, it's the people that are voting for them. So they have a new name and a new label, but in a way, it's still kind of very much a part of Cold War politics, which shapes East German opinions on Israel until today.
Well, I agree with you, Hannes. I don't think I have much to add.
David?
Okay. Yes. Right. Well, thank you both. I found this fascinating. Before my name was DeWitt, it was Wittgenstein. And my father, when he escaped from Germany, became an officer in the British Army for the Second World War, was required to change his name. So this has been a nice and very, very interesting and nuanced, quick snapshot of important things. I have a couple of questions, which we may not get through all of them, especially if there's questions from others. The first one is, I guess, one of curiosity. One of the things that struck me, certainly when I was a university student and an observer of things, was what I thought was an intense network of relations between the Social Democrats. The Social Democrats in Canada, the Social Democrats in Israel, the Social Democrats in Europe, and in particular in Germany. And I'm wondering what has happened to that as a movement that tried to sustain, if not a commonality, at least a common set of understandings and values that would inform the kinds of normative positions that they would take in their respective countries to influence policy. And Germany seemed to be a very important leader, if not the leader, of that. Does that exist anymore? And to what extent has it made any impact on relations, either with Israel in particular, or on the articulation of goals and procedures on the peace processes, the peace efforts that have still to be actualized?
First of all, I regret that anyone changed their name from Wittgenstein, because that's such an important and beautiful name. But I think in the 60s and 70s, in the early years of German-Israeli relations, you're absolutely correct. A lot were relations within the social democratic international networks. A lot of the relations were relations between also parties and networks that were very important in these societies at the time, which they are for a long time, they've lost this importance. The Histadrut, the Israeli labor union, and the German social democrats and labor unions, they had intense relationships, and many of the local exchanges happened on that level. But that, of course, Israel has changed dramatically in its political outlook. The Social Democrat, whatever is left from the Labor Party, is a tiny fragment of Israeli political scenery. In Germany, they have had a comeback and have a chancellor again, but you're still much smaller party than they used to be. And they've also changed. And just to end this, and Johannes may have to add, if you look back in the 70s, it wasn't all a harmonious relationship either in these international social democratic networks. Think of the Austrian Chancellor Bruno Kreisky, who happened to be the one Jew. Now it's Zelensky, but back then there was one other Jewish leader of the European state, the Austrian Chancellor Kreisky. He was not a lover of Israel, and he was not loved in Israel. He was, I think, the first Western leader to meet with Arafat when he was still considered a terrorist. And he had terrible fights, not only with Begin, but before that with Golda Meir. And Willy Brandt, I mean, he was, I think, a really amazing German politician, and himself, of course, a fighter against the Nazis. And that's what also connected them. But as part of the international socialist movement, he was also, in the 70s, moving more closely towards the Palestinian leadership and seeing Israel more critically. And certainly his social democratic successor as chancellor, Helmut Schmidt, who has later turned out also had a Jewish family background, but everybody in Israel saw him as a German Wehrmacht officer. He was not a big friend of Israel, or never seen as a big friend of Israel. So and then, Helmut Kohl, then the more conservative chancellor, after kind of bumpy start, developed a pretty good relationship to an Israel that now became dominated by right-wing parties as well. So, and I apologize, I have to leave in a few minutes. I can't stay till 1:30.
Well, goodbye and thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. It's wonderful. And there is some time left for, if there's questions from people who are, there's still a lot of people out there listening. So if people have questions, please put them in the Q&A. And in the meantime, David, you said you had another question?
Yes. Yeah. No, let me try one more on my list here. How influential are the parties and the non-governmental organizations, the NGOs, on government policy in terms of Germany's stand and willingness to commit resources to the ongoing and never-ending, it seems so far, never successful peace process? And I ask that because there's, in your comments, you've often said, well, now it's only you, Johannes, but you and Michael both differentiated between the state and parties, which I think is entirely appropriate, state and government. Certainly, I know that from an Israeli perspective, there's often criticism leveled against the activism of European NGOs in both their role in Israel, but their role in trying to influence government and political parties in the support of what is often perceived as the support of Palestinians over the state of Israel. Now, I'm not saying I agree with that, but it is a big part of a conversation that I've observed, and I'm wondering if you can unpack a bit of that for us.
I'll do my best. Of course, this is a sensitive subject. Yeah. So everyone who hasn't done 2 years of Hebrew, please leave the room. If you look at the way that Israel operates in the occupied territories or the West Bank, to an extent, Israeli governance functions have been outsourced to the European Union, to the UN, to all kinds of NGOs and donors. So I'm somewhat skeptical when it comes to this bashing of NGOs. I mean, obviously, people who are working in the occupied territories and who are in daily contact with Palestinians on the ground, they might have a somewhat skeptical perspective on Israeli policies that are maybe very different from German left-wing super pro-Zionists sitting in Berlin in a safe distance from Ramallah. My impression is that there is kind of a core consensus when it comes to German foreign policy towards Israel and the Palestinians, which is this strong commitment to German responsibility for Israeli well-being and to strategic defense, combined with kind of the insistence on keeping any kind of two-state solution, at least theoretically, on the table, to put it mildly. I think that's the official position. Now, if this two-state solution would become even more unlikely than it currently is, this might be something to reconsider. I don't see that happening currently, and I'm not sure that kind of these ongoing process of verbal or rhetorical radicalization among certain NGOs is having a huge impact, right? So more and more left-wing NGOs are coming out with, it's definitely apartheid, it's worse than apartheid. I don't see that vocabulary entering mainstream German discourse.
Oh, Howard, is that a new hand or an old hand?
That's my hand. I wanted to ask, in terms of the invasion, Germany did a 180-degree about face and went way overboard with military help, with taking in Ukrainians, with sanctions, with cutting off the oil pipeline, etc. On the other hand, Israel has been walking a tightrope, sometimes endorsing sanctions, but not openly in a way, criticizing Putin. You know all about that, and keeping certain lines open and giving rationales about Syria and its opponents, Hezbollah in Syria. How has that affected German-Israeli relations?
Probably too early to tell. I think we would, when it comes to kind of German policy towards Russia and Ukraine, it's important to distinguish between kind of German rhetoric, so this intensification of the German military budget, promises to deliver military hardware, and what's actually happening on the ground. So there's a certain commitment gap when it comes to German foreign policy towards Ukraine. I think Germans are not the only ones to notice that Israel is somewhat hesitant. Then again, Israel is kind of not immediately, but indirectly, it's kind of a neighbor of Russia, right? So the Russian military is operating at the Israeli border, and I think, or I would hope, that it's something that Germans are able to understand.
Is there so what's happened there? Ukrainian Jews who are fleeing into Germany, I mean, or Ukrainians fleeing into Germany, some of whom are Jewish. And I think there's some discussion in Israel about Israel assuming that it will be taking in lots of Ukrainians. Is this a possible, once again, a source of tension that Jews in the former Soviet Union would rather go to Western Europe or to North America rather than go to Israel? Has there been conversation about this in the German press or in the German Jewish public conversation?
I mean, it's this whole policy of demographic engineering, of inviting post-Soviet Jews to Germany to refill the congregations, again, is a sensitive subject. In a way, it helped the German image. Kind of a German hegemony within the European Union would have been, I think, impossible without this reinvention of being a new and very different Germany and flourishing of Jewish life. If you look at it more skeptically, these huge numbers of immigrants didn't really contribute to large congregations, also because the Germans decided to spread them across the entire country. So demographically speaking, the congregations are relatively middle-aged and older, and the smaller ones are probably dying out in a generation, which leads to this interesting phenomenon that people who were very much engaged in this process that I would have described as reforestation or reinvention of Jewish life in Germany, they're very much hoping that new Jewish migration from Eastern Europe would fill the ranks of their congregations, which really makes you wonder to what extent Jewish life in Germany actually is sustainable without increased Jewish migration. I'm not convinced that huge numbers of Ukrainian Jews will actually come to Germany in the end, but this fantasy does very much exist.
Any other questions from either one of you or from people? There's been, because this has been a fascinating overview. It just reminds me of when in it was very early on. It would have been before the mass immigration, but when some Jews from the former Soviet Union were coming to Israel, the first wave of refuseniks. And I remember a very dear German friend of mine, non-Jewish, who had grown up in the rubble of post-World War II Berlin, and who was a sincere philo-Semite, was very excited about Jews from the, at that time, Soviet Union coming to Germany. She said it will be our second chance, and she believed it. So there's different levels of cynicism or of sincerity behind that, and just raises this bigger issue of how and when the unique special relationship will go back to being merely a special relationship. David, do you want to ask a final question before we finish up?
Unless Johannes wants to answer yours or respond to your observation. No? I'm sure.
I mean, look, my wife is Ukrainian Jewish, so she's part of this wave of Jewish migration that came in the 90s. So I personally benefited from this wave. I think when it comes to the pluralization of German society, this wave played a huge role. The Central Council of Jews in Germany, I think, did their best to integrate them. And kind of the second generation is growing up more religious than their parents. So they're rediscovering Jewish roots, which were kind of problematic under Soviet rule. To what extent these people which are born in Germany will understand themselves as German Jews? That's an interesting question. My impression is that in terms of basic culture and self-understanding, they're still very much seeing themselves as post-Soviet Jews. So they're speaking Russian at home, they're celebrating the victory of the Red Army over Germany. So they see themselves as winners of World War II. So it's a very different narrative than you had among the 30,000 Jews that existed in Germany before reunification and this new wave.
So let me quickly ask. I can't resist. For quite a number of years, primarily in the 90s and the first 10 years in the 2000s, much of my work ended up involving European scholars, as well as people from other parts of the world. And what struck me, and what I was being told by my European colleagues over and over, wherever they came from, they would say, you're working with a European scholar. It's not that I'm Swiss or I'm German or I'm French. My son goes, I live in Switzerland. My son goes to university in Germany. My daughter is in France, and my other daughter married an Italian. To what extent, however, is the last 10 years where there seems to be a resurgence of national identity altering this in terms of a reaffirmation or a renewed confirmation of nationalism, national identity, and to the extent that there is this duality going on, do you find that there's what kind of a relationship exists between the German Jews and the French Jews, for example, and the British Jews, or the British Jews before Brexit, for part of Europe? Is there a European Jewish identity which you would be comfortable identifying or talking about, or is it really embedded as being national Jewish, whatever the national is?
My impression is that there are kind of networks, formal and informal, of European Jews. And of course, there is kind of this emphasis to not forget about European Jewry, right? There's always this focus on the two large communities. So it's Israel and North America. And in European Jews, in terms of numbers and political and cultural impact, are maybe less relevant, but they still do exist. My impression is that when it comes to local politics or to self-understanding, it's very much within national frameworks, simply given very different histories of migration, right? So the Jewish communities in France are very much shaped by people who very often came from North Africa. Jewish communities in Germany, as we now discussed several times, are people who came from the Russian-speaking world, whether it's Ukraine or Russia. And bringing these very different narratives and different ideas of observance and positions towards Israel together is maybe a challenge for the future generations. That's a beautiful final sentence, I think.
Right, and it's an interesting segue to not only back to Derek, but to remind people that last week we had a session on the EU and Israel, and the complexities there, where Germany is really the engine of the EU. So, Derek?
Yes. So I think, as a final joke, if people tell you they're European, they're probably a German. That's just something I wanted to point out.
Right. But if Europeans have read far more Hebrew literature than anyone on the call today, they're also probably German. I'm just amazed at how quickly and how abundantly Hebrew literature, Israeli literature, is translated into German. I know that David Grossman's latest novel, which Was Nina Wusste or something, it was translated into German a year and a half before it came out in English. And that's pretty typical. So anyway, it's been fascinating. So I really want to thank Johannes and Michael in absentia for a great discussion. And as always, to thank Holy Blossom Temple and David for organizing this. And of course, to Rabbi Goodman and Les Rothschild for helping make this all possible. It's been, a fantastic series. And so I'll sign off there. And then, but we this is not our last session though, right? We have the April 8th one. So
Correct.
who does the honor? Yeah.
Derek, thank you so much for leading us today. And of course, thank you to all of our panelists and to our guests. Yes, just about last word, April 8th. We're meeting again, 12 o'clock Eastern time. I've posted in the chat box once or twice a link where people can go and let us know some questions, some areas of interest. I'll also email that again. It really just takes about 30 seconds to fill out and will really help us have a more robust conversation on the 8th. And let's say to please try to fill that out by Wednesday, April 6th, so that the panel has time to pull together their thoughts. With that, we'll just say thank you and Shabbat Shalom to those who celebrate. And this was wonderful. Thank you again for another fabulous conversation. Take care, everyone.
Shabbat Shalom, everyone.
Hello.
Shalom and Johannes, thank you so much.
Welcome.